So, Johannes, why don't you tell us how you came into the prototype carbon fund, or the carbon finance business as it came to be known later?
Thank you, Chandrasekhar, for inviting me, first of all, to this interview. Carbon finance was a great development at the World Bank, and that certainly attracted me to come here. But my experience goes back far beyond my start here at the World Bank. Before the bank, I was at the Kiel Institute in Germany, an institute for economics. And we had been asked to develop a concept for emissions trading study, and we did that for CO2 emissions trading. And it had already quite a few of these features that we then developed. So it was a great opportunity for me when the bank at the time, Ivan Tandberg, all of a sudden called me and asked whether I would want to come and join the team that was being built at the bank to experiment a little bit with what was at the time called activities implemented jointly. Norway, during the negotiations of the convention, had put joint implementation into the text, and activities implemented jointly was a pilot phase. And we were supposed to see how that could be made operational in terms of methodologies. That then became my job, and in terms of investments and the whole project cycle. And we had to develop everything from scratch then, terminology and everything. That's where the story started.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the early successes and lessons from the AIJ program itself, what were they, and how did they lead towards the setting up of the prototype carbon fund?
Yeah, interestingly enough, we did some methodology work because that's what the UNFCCC Secretariat was looking at. They were tasked with the job to write text. At the time, that was targeted to the meeting in Marrakesh on modalities and procedures for the CDM. So they started early with AIJ, and we, on the one hand, worked to develop these concepts on baselines and additionality. But then we also looked around the bank for pilot projects. And I have to give credit to the GF. The GF was already working on energy efficiency, in this case in Mexico, and there was a project that reduced energy consumption, but also greenhouse gas along with it. So we used that project to test some of the methods that we had developed, in particular the whole verification cycle. That was one of the great experiences early on, and we still have a certificate from that period. The first ever developed project issued a certificate for carbon credits. And if you want, I can show it to you.
Yeah, we will take a record of it. And I remember that when I was leaving the carbon finance unit, you gave me a framed copy of it. So yes. I have it in my office, and I see it very frequently, but we'll take a shot of it for record in the film as well. But that was the ILUMEX project.
That was the ILUMEX project, yes.
And how did the work under the AIJ program lead to the discussions related to the Kyoto Protocol all the way up to Marrakesh? And what were the key contributions of the bank to that overall process in those early years?
Well, part of the idea that Norway had, and some other countries that joined later on, part of that idea was to help negotiators understand what this animal actually would look like in terms of the practicalities, the modalities and procedures, as it was called. And this is what we try to do on a conceptual level, but then also in practice. The prototype carbon fund later on was actually set up with that same idea. That's why it's called a prototype, to test how the asset, the product that could be traded in a future carbon market would be created in the first place. What regulatory mechanisms you would need, what instruments, what institutions you would need to actually do this.
And
I think that was one of our main contributions during this time. I remember very well that we wrote papers after papers to feed that into the process and inform negotiators on what we had discovered, what we were doing.
And in the process leading to Marrakesh itself, and not only elaborating on the concept of baseline and the concept of additionality, I think there was a lot of work also done in terms of defining what steps or milestones in the project cycle were relevant as far as creation of the carbon asset was concerned.
Well, that is correct. As part of that, we needed to create a lot of language. First of all, I mean, interestingly, the first papers that we wrote were pretty long because everything had to be described, explained, defined. As the terminology became better known, things started to slim down. That was an interesting experience, quite frankly, that you create not just concepts, but actually a language around these concepts that people then can agree on and discuss more complex problems. Just as an example, I remember I was in a UNFC workshop on AIJ somewhere in Africa, and the question was how do we call this phase where we have to ascertain that some project that creates carbon credits is real, would actually do what it's supposed to do. And there were various terms and so forth, and together with that Nosc Veritas, a company that does certification and which we had hired, we were thinking about terminology, and we came up with this term validation. So validate a project, including the scenarios that you would use to describe the baseline and all that. So validation became a term, and distinct from verification, that was then the term for certifying, for later on confirming and then certifying the carbon credits at the end of the project cycle. That just as an example. It was not understood, first of all, how detailed this work would have to be and what had to be created and be contributed.
Yeah.
Contributed to it in a significant way.
Yeah, the whole concept of ex ante validation versus ex post verification kind of dominates the thinking around creation of carbon assets even today.
That is correct. That was one of the defining ideas. Another one where we had, initially at least, a bit of a dispute with the regulators in the executive board of the CDM was around baselines additionality. We had understood baselines in terms of a scenario that then could be described and which would be associated with a certain amount of emissions. And then there would be a project scenario that would also be associated with emissions, and the difference of the two would be carbon, would be carbon that can be certified as credits. So if there was carbon, meaning that the baseline emissions were higher than the project emissions, this carbon would be additional. That's not how they saw it, actually. They saw the baseline in terms of only the emissions in a pre-project scenario, and then wanted to define the project as additional to what would happen otherwise. When we submitted our first methodology, we explained how we were seeing it, that basically if you have a project scenario defined and you have a baseline scenario defined and you take the difference, then that is additional. They didn't buy it. And from from that point on, we had cycles and cycles of discussions, what actually the relationship between additionality and baseline would be. It actually literally went around in cycles. The advantage in the end, where the parties came around, was that they were able to define standards for baselines and additionality. Very early in the process, there was already that idea, why don't we have technologies that are additional in any case, a positive list. Yeah. That was a non-negotiable point early on. Later on, they came around to the fact that this needs to be part of the process, because otherwise it's just going to be too complicated.
That I remember, losing losing in that discussion on baseline and additionality, in my mind, not as a methodology person but as a project person, was perhaps one of the most significant inefficiencies that was built into the overall regulatory framework, because of the difficulty in trying to talk about additionality. And if you talk to project developers even today, the thing that has scarred them the most with regard to the CDM is this whole idea of additionality and proving additionality or counterfactual to a project case, rather than the additionality of emission reduction.
Yeah, it is very difficult in an environment of business uncertainty and political uncertainty, quite frankly, because the executive board changed its opinion, its decisions sometimes, or refined its decisions according to what they saw as politically expedient, and also sometimes in reaction to what they expected the market to produce. There were concerns of oversupply, undersupply, and depending on that, they tended to fill with a methodology. That is, of course, very, very problematic for any market. So the political environment that, in the political regulatory system that created this asset in the first place, was too uncertain for it to be an easy product that would allow financiers to invest in projects. That is something where the bank could actually have helped more to finance these projects in this environment. In the bank, we thought actually that the market would be there, the demand would be there from the European trading system, from the American side, and so on. The US then dropped out. The European trading system became oversupplied. And we didn't react much to it. We just kept going, producing credits, doing our methodology work, without doing the work that would have been needed to deal with these uncertainties that were brought in from the political side.
So we'll come back. Let's come back to that whole idea of what the bank could have done differently somewhere around 2005, 6, 7. But let's continue a little bit on the early years on the methodology side, because of its significance and the significance of the bank's own involvement, the whole idea of learning by doing. In those initial years, how did we move towards doing third-party project as opposed to getting involved in more of World Bank projects, and what implication did it have on the methodology work that was undertaken by your team?
To develop a carbon market at the World Bank was predicated on the idea that we have projects anyway, in energy, in agriculture, and so forth, forestry, and so on, that we could use, on which we could build to create carbon credits. We learned that that was not so easy, partly because the methodologies were not clearly defined and we were experimenting, which was a big risk to our product teams. But it was also very difficult to explain that to our clients. What would they get? How would we make a payment? How would they have to pre-finance the project? What actually is the product that you sell here? Well, now talk easily about carbon assets, but that's not at all clear. It's something that has not happened, an emission that doesn't exist. So, I mean, what are you selling? Hot air, or and there were clients that simply took a long time to get it. That there was a possibility to get paid for something that is quantified and verified and so forth, but is the result of not emitting gases. First of all, you don't see the greenhouse gases, and then you get maybe a paper, and you pay for the paper for not emitting what you don't see in the first. It's a very strange concept. So the market really, the whole approach, the market really is purely one that is based on procedures, processes, methodologies. Without that, it would not exist. It's a political market.
It's market created out of regulation. There's no natural demand for it the way it is there for coffee or oil. It's basically scarcity created out of regulation.
Even if you have demand for it, because you might limit the emissions in an economy, that could create demand. But even with that demand, it's not clear that you have an asset, a product that would satisfy this demand without the political process to create it in the first place.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of the early years and the methodology, how did the World Bank go around getting the people who would work on it, build partnerships with outside institutions to develop the methodologies? I recall that in the early years we were the dominant player providing the new methodologies till the private sector and the broader community stepped in.
Yeah. I mean, the way the system was set up by the executive board was the following. You could submit projects for their consideration to be registered as CDM projects. And at the start of this process, of course, there were no methodologies yet, so they asked to submit, along with the project idea, a methodology that would allow to assess the baseline and to calculate emission reductions ex post. We had, by that time, not only experience from a few AIJ projects, which were not for credit, by the way, and from work on the Product Carbon Fund, where we were starting to develop a pipeline. So we were one of the few that started submitting projects along with methodologies, let's say for power plants, for energy efficiency, for all sorts of processes. Those methodologies were then considered by the executive board with the help of the methodology panel that they had set up, and commented on, modified, and then agreed. Over time, a body of methodologies grew up that then project developers could use, could apply when they developed further project opportunities. They would apply those both to the development of the project idea, to defining it, and also they would apply it to and describe it in the project's submission to how these credits would then be calculated, both on the baseline and in terms of the emissions from the project.
Johannes, now let's look at a little bit as to what the bank did right, which you've described a little bit in the initial phases, and then what we could have done differently or what we did not do. Certainly post 2005 when the Kyoto Protocol got ratified.
Yeah. I think what the bank did right in the first place is to discover this as an opportunity to deal with a public goods problem, and use the private sector to raise the financing that was necessary at the scale that was anticipated. This is something that the bank had never done before. The World Bank as a development institution is not normally the institution of choice to create a market. And to do this, which you might think of as a limitation, with developing countries is even more difficult because the capacity is not there. But we saw it also as an opportunity because that's where the projects were supposed to be. In developing countries, the costs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions was lower and would be lower as governments in industrial countries were tightening the regulation around efficiency of energy use and greenhouse gases generally. So that certainly was an innovation, an institutional innovation that the bank was even willing to go down that route. We saw the opportunity to work with the private sector on this. And I think of this as, for the World Bank, a great innovation. We created the Project Carbon Fund with a couple of governments, but a large number of companies as well, who invested in the PCF because they wanted to do the right thing as corporate citizens, but they also saw the opportunity to get carbon credits. They didn't know what to do with them at that time, but they had an idea that maybe there was a business to come out of this. And we were confident that we could connect that with the needs of our developing country clients. That was a great way of creating a new product for the World Bank and at the same time trying to tackle climate change.
So, Johannes, let's talk a little bit about what the bank could have or should have done post the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol, what the opportunities were there which we didn't fully take or didn't take at all.
Well, as I said, I think we assumed that based on the Kyoto Protocol, demand would be there, that the market would be there. So we didn't need to take care of that side of the business. That proved to be incorrect. For the reasons mentioned, the US dropping out and the European trading system being oversupplied, we were struggling with prices for carbon, and our contracts reflected that. We tried to do a fixed contract first under the PCF, but then the contracts had variable prices depending on market trends, which became an additional risk, an additional difficulty for our clients. So what I think is what we could have done differently is to react to this uncertainty of demand and maybe created our own demand for our own credits. It would have been probably a smaller market for World Bank carbon credits, but a more stable one. One idea that we had very early on was to work with the airlines. And we looked at what you get in terms of miles when you fly, let's say from New York to London. And it turned out that the carbon credits that you needed to neutralize the emissions was just a fraction of those miles that you were earning. You can turn that into a demand. So if we had worked directly with civil society groups, the financial markets maybe, to create a bit demand, that could have created a more stable carbon market, at least in terms of the demonstration that we wanted wanted to do. Secondly, what I would have liked to see are some financial products around carbon projects. A constant problem was that we did not have investment finance. The payments that we would make under our carbon contracts were always made many, many years after the investment. Because you first had to create the asset, you first had to invest and then verify and so forth before you would make a payment. And the process itself the verification process itself added years to it. So these projects and those that invested in them had to wait for often 10 years before they saw a single dollar. That became another difficulty, and it would have been great to be able to monetize these credits early on, before they were actually created, and put money into the generation of projects much more quickly than what we were able to do.
So the trade-off between early payments and the importance of creating result-based finance as an instrument, and there's obviously the trade-off that project entities end up getting paid later when you have result-based finance, but creating a whole new product line which creates an incentive for performance-based payment system as opposed to project finance, obviously has a significance. I think we needed to develop product which allowed some of that future payment to be securitized in a manner which could contribute to project financing. But in the balance, do you think we should have followed a project finance model or a result-based finance model?
Well, the results-based model was thought of earlier. I mean, that was as a concept around at the time. The problem with carbon finance is that it just took too long. When you do results-based, you can define milestones against which you pay. They're not linked to the creation in a complex regulatory process of carbon credits after so many years. You're not free. You're obliged to follow that complicated process, at the end of which you may have carbon credits or not. And we have many, many projects that yielded much, much, much less than what we had anticipated, or nothing at all. Which, of course, over time, companies, governments that invested in these projects, they learned how high these risks could be. Yeah. I would think the regulatory risk, quite frankly, added much to the project risk that is already in these projects.
That's a very good point, that result-based finance based on the project company assuming risks way beyond their control probably certainly adds to the overall risk of the project. So it should be based on something which is better defined ex ante, no?
Well, if we had been free to make certain payments from our carbon funds at some milestones, that would have focused our partner's mind on getting it right. What we experienced is that the timeline was so long that they started thinking about alternatives, did not respect the methodologies, which then created problems in the verification process and so forth. So there could have been cleverer ways to deal with this in more direct, working more directly with incentives that our clients respond to.
And going forward, what do you see the prospects of business like the carbon finance business in terms of doing more of the same, more trust funds which purchase offsets through new methodologies, potentially in a new framework, or should our business model evolve?
I mean, the old CDM market is dead. We are wrapping up what we call the Kyoto funds. There are some innovative funds, like the Community Development Carbon Fund, the Forest Carbon Funds, the BioCF, and so on, which focus not only on creating carbon assets, but actually on co-benefits for communities, for other environmental goods. That is useful. it's also useful in making a case for these projects. I don't want to lose this. But beyond that, the capacity in the market has been built quite rapidly, actually. There were lots of small companies at the time when the Kyoto market was buzzing that created a business out of this. Some were closed down, others were bought out later on. But the capacity is still in the market, and we don't need to do everything in-house. What I think would be important is to increasingly work with maturing carbon markets. Carbon markets are here to stay. Certainly in some countries, some jurisdictions, we have almost mature systems right now. The bank could very well work with those and supply those markets and focus on creating the financial environment around the projects in developing countries that would allow to supply those markets. Secondly, with the Paris Agreement, there's a whole new game. Carbon credits or carbon finance is defined differently under Paris. We don't yet know what this will be. And the bank is working already on defining these new rules for this new game. So that's also valuable, I think. Beyond this, I think we should still work on refining this carbon asset. There are blockchain developments that can be used for carbon credits. Carbon credits, carbon markets more look like currencies. These are things that we can work on and make useful for development.
And you think that these new technology developments can go beyond, like blockchain and so on, can go beyond refining the process to defining the asset as well?
I'm not an expert on blockchains, but I have seen its potential. When I worked early on carbon markets, it was really clear that there's a potential for carbon markets to develop a currency or become a currency essentially. And blockchains that didn't exist at the time would nicely underwrite such a development. I mean, currently, these cryptocurrencies are valuable because it takes a lot of energy, physical energy, computer power and so forth to create them. Well, to create carbon assets costs a lot of money too. So essentially that could also be a currency that is hard to inflate. You would have to invest actually in a way that would help the environment and economies while you create a currency that can be traded. It's a wild idea, I know, but something that we like to think of.
To conclude, I think you've highlighted that one of the major innovation or success of the bank was to bring in the private sector into the area of public goods by investing some of their capital. Looking back, are there other areas where you think the whole work around carbon markets did something which the bank had never done before?
Well, everything around carbon markets was something that the bank had not done before.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly. And I can tell you that, and you know very well, that even within the bank, the procedures that the bank has for developing its projects were not adequate. They were not made for dealing with carbon projects. So we started out even redefining the World Bank's own processes. Everything was new.
Yeah. And going forward, you see the opportunity for us to continue, the World Bank to continue to engage in this kind of innovation?
Well, carbon has become a recognized business in the bank. It is not as hyped up as it used to be when carbon prices were high and the demand was there in the market. And when our counterparts in the bank and in client countries were still not well informed about the risks. I do have hopes that with a new system under the Paris Agreement and hopefully better procedures, better methodologies, informed by this first period under Kyoto, that we would get a carbon asset where the bank can play a role to supply those new markets. But we might want to work more with those emerging carbon markets and their definition of the rules and procedures, and not rely entirely on the international system to do this. The international system, whether it's under Kyoto and the Market Accord at the time, or whether it's under Paris and what comes next now in the next few COPs, in terms of the implementing mortality for Article 6, it will continue to be very political and contentious and always at risk of being overturned or modified in a way that the markets won't like it. That risk is it's smaller when you deal with national or nationally based car markets, because the political process there is more defined.
Okay.
Not always, but there's a chance that this works better.
Great. So thanks a lot, Johannes. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You're welcome.